Welcome to this special edition of Diabetes Day by Day, where we will focus on helping people with diabetes and/or overweight and obesity understand the difference between FDA-approved medications, compounded medications, and counterfeit medications. This special edition of Diabetes Day by Day is being sponsored by Lilly. I'm your host, Dr. Neil Skolnik, Professor of Family and Community Medicine at the Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University, and joining me today, as always, is my co-host.
Neil, I'm excited for this conversation. I'm Sara Wettergreen, an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, Skaggs School of Pharmacy, and an ambulatory care clinical pharmacist.
Also joining us for this discussion today is Dr. Susan Kuchera. Dr. Kuchera is Clinical Assistant Professor of Family and Community Medicine at the Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University and Program Director of the Family Medicine Residency at Jefferson Health Abington. Welcome, Sue.
It is so great to be here, Neil and Sarah. Thanks so much for having me.
And also joining us is Lisa Kessler. Lisa is an infant toddler home-based pediatric speech language pathologist who will share with us her perspective on this issue, a critically important perspective as a patient. Lisa, welcome to Diabetes Day by Day.
Thank you very much. And just to share, I've been Dr. Skolnik's patient for over 20 years.
And it has been an absolute pleasure. Those 20 years, Lisa, have gone by quickly. This is an important podcast exploring an issue that we never thought we'd have to think about, which is understanding the difference between FDA-approved medications, compounded medications, and counterfeit medications. This is a confusing area, and it's become relevant for all of us since the rise in prescribing of highly effective weight loss medications. We're all familiar with them, particularly the medications semaglutide, brand names Ozempic and Wegovy, and tirzepatide, brand names Mounjaro and Zepbound. These medicines have led to wonderful advances in the area of obesity management and weight management, but they've also led to both compounded and counterfeit medications being sold to and purchased by patients far more commonly than any time I can remember in over 30 years of practice. In the first part of today's podcast, we'll discuss what compounded and counterfeit medications are and some of the concerns about compounded and counterfeit medications. Then, in the second part of the podcast, we'll have a discussion about some of the things that may go into a decision about using a compounded medication. Sarah, let's start with you. And to start out, can you clarify for us what we mean when we talk about compounded and counterfeit medications? What are they?
Absolutely, Neil. As a pharmacist, I really want to dive into more details on this subject. So, I really want to first start by talking about what compounded medications are and when they might be best used or when they're most appropriate, some of the distinctions and how their medication process compares to our traditional FDA approved medications. And then we'll talk about counterfeit medications at the end. So, starting with that, you were exactly right. I agree with you. I have never heard about compounded medications as much at any time in my career as we have right now. And that's specifically related to these GLP-1 type medications that you mentioned, Neil. And really, the reason that these started becoming compounded because there was a period of time when there was a shortage of these types of medications. And to meet the need during that time of shortage, we saw some compounding happening, and then it just exploded. So, starting off with compounded medications can play an important role in patient care. We're not going to say that there's no role for compounded medications. I think of it in times when maybe a critical medication is not available and a compound can meet that need. Or I also think of patients who have specialized needs related to medications. Maybe they can't swallow a tablet form and there's no liquid commercially available. And so a compounded pharmacy could create a liquid formulation of that medication. Another example I think of from my own practice is some people are allergic to excipients in tablets of medications, and there's only tablets available. And so compounding can meet some of these specialized needs. In these types of scenarios I've talked about so far, and when I traditionally have thought about compounding pharmacies, I'm thinking of a provider and a patient already having a relationship, the provider sending a prescription order for the compound to a local compounding pharmacy. But things have really changed. And so one of the important distinctions to think about, even in that traditional compounding process, is that compounded drugs are not FDA approved. They might have a similar drug ingredient, but the product itself has not been FDA approved. And that means it didn't go through the rigorous FDA review process for safety, quality, and effectiveness that our standard prescriptions do, that you would think of getting dispensed at a traditional pharmacy. To clarify that a little bit more, when a drug is FDA approved, every step of the manufacturing is very carefully regulated. You talked about this on your professional podcast, but there are many, many, many steps that go into that process, and many steps of checks and balances and regulations to make sure that the product is what it says that it is, that there's no contaminants, and that it's meeting these very strict quality standards. And the final product has to prove that it's both safe and effective. Comparatively, when we think about compounded medications, these can vary widely because they're made in different pharmacies. They might be made in small or large batches, depending on where they're being made. And all of this happens with little oversight. So, this introduces a lot of inconsistencies and variability into the products that aren't going through these rigorous testing processes that we see in FDA approved medications. And so, with this, we also see some concerns and some potential differences related to side effects. You mentioned
Yeah,
an even bigger issue at the beginning, Neil, and that's counterfeit medications. So, in contrast to both of these types, so the FDA approved traditional medications or compounded medications, we also have counterfeit. With counterfeit, these are not only made without oversight, but they might not even contain what they say they do. I think that's really hard to process because we want to have trust in the healthcare system and we want to have trust in the medications that we see. And so if you're ordering a medication that ends up being counterfeit, maybe from an online website, that's really scary because you don't know what's in it. It might have a different amount of the active ingredient than listed, or it might not even have any of the active ingredient. It might have sugar or chalk, and some might even have harmful substances. So even in contrast to compounded medications, which at least attempt to replicate a real drug, these are completely falsified or fake medications, and they can be really dangerous. So some online suppliers have started selling these counterfeit products for their own financial gain. And I think this is why I start to call this the wild, wild west, is this is unlike any other time we've seen with medications, medication use, of the explosion of compounding pharmacies, but also these counterfeit medication suppliers that have made it really hard to figure out where to go and how to navigate this process.
Sarah, I love the term you use, the wild, wild west, because it really is. We've moved into an era where we really have been able to trust the medicines we get at a pharmacy. We understand the supply chain that starts with the formulation of a medication and then the manufacturing of it into whether it's an injection or a pill, and then the whole supply chain all the way down to a knowledgeable pharmacist who's counting out the prescription and hands it to or mails it to a patient. And there's oversight, there's regulations, and there's very careful quality control that's done at each one of those steps. And then again, your term, the wild, wild west, which is often used to describe a place where there are no rules and everyone does things on their own, is a wonderful description, because it isn't to say that everyone doing this is doing it wrong, but it's just to say we don't have any idea who might be doing this responsibly and who might not be. Sarah?
Exactly. And that really highlights too that oftentimes that practice, this new if you're ordering it online or getting it from a compounding pharmacy, that's often in silo to what you might be getting for the rest of your healthcare. So, like you mentioned, in addition to dispensing the medication at the pharmacy, the pharmacist is also checking for drug interactions, seeing if there's any concerns about your other conditions and how this medication might work together in that tandem. And so by separating it out, that's, one risk alone, but you also don't know where the medication is coming completely. And so lots of different steps that have provided trust in our traditional healthcare system have fallen apart in some ways when you do things online or potentially get it from counterfeit suppliers.
Yeah, and the other thing that happens, and Sue, I'd be interested in your thoughts here. When someone comes into your office and wants to talk about a weight loss medicine, is the only thing that happens between wanting to talk about it and getting the medicine is you saying, here's a prescription, or are there other important things that might not be happening when you go online?
Right. Yeah. So you would hope, that this is someone I've built a relationship with. And there are, even the FDA approved medications, the GLP type medications have side effects, right? They have long-term things that we need to talk about, and it's a discussion, right? Anytime we prescribe a medicine for somebody, we should be telling them, what are the side effects? How do we get you through the side effects? What are the long-term consequences? How are we going to adjust your dosing, right? That's our duty to our patient, is to make sure they have all of that information before starting any medication. So yeah, I feel like keeping your primary care clinician in the loop is really important, because none of these things live in a silo. They all interact with everything else you have going on in your world. And I think keeping everybody in the loop is best for patients, and it helps me take better care of my patients.
Yeah, and Lisa, this is a nice segue into the second part of our discussion where we really wanted to focus on the patient experience and decisions. Now, can you tell us a little bit about what went into your decision about whether to use a regular FDA-approved medication obtained through a pharmacy versus a compounded medicine?
Sure. Well, I was so lucky again to have you as a physician, where you took the time to see me not once but twice to discuss this matter. After we went over my lab work for one session, you said, I would like to see you again to discuss going on Zepbound, and you weren't ready to put me on it that moment. So I made an appointment to come back to discuss it. And as usual, you educated me about Zepbound, since that's what we decided to prescribe, and also about compounds. You were honest with me, since you being a physician and also an educator, you said that you had researched the new medications, the new GLP-1s, and you had learned a lot, and you shared with me many of the things that you learned as it pertained to me as your patient. And I had agreed that I would do the Zepbound. I was very excited to do it. You did talk to me about side effects, possible side effects that you knew of, how to diet, how to exercise, that I needed to supplement proteins, and that what the cost would be. So I was all in, because I knew you would be following up with me on a monthly basis, and I felt very confident. Unfortunately, what happened after then was what Sarah had mentioned, where suddenly everything, the manufacturing had delays, and I was calling pharmacies and calling Dr. Skolnik's office and saying, can you change the prescription from this pharmacy to that pharmacy, because this one can't get the prescription. And that's when I was panicked, because I had committed to doing this. I was excited to do it. I wanted to get healthy. And of course, I started to research what was out there. What is this compounding? Why did the FDA approve compounding? And therefore, even though Dr. Skolnik had told me the negatives about it, I said, well, look, if I can't get it, maybe I should start with the compounding, but maybe I need to find the legitimate compounding source, so I know I'm not getting a counterfeit. And of course, if you need a doctor's prescription, then that compounding pharmacy must be having oversight by the FDA since they were given this responsibility to compound. But after my research, I found out there was no oversight once the FDA assigned different compounding manufacturers. And that scared me. And everything Dr. Skolnik had said really resonated. And I did the right thing as an educated consumer of don't trust what you're hearing, don't trust what you're seeing, trust who you trust and have always trusted, and use your physician and make the right decision. And if I have to wait till they're available, I had to wait till they're available.
You know, it's interesting, Lisa. As I listen, there are two things that stand out to me. One is how you did your homework. I mean, that's what we all should do. When we're talking about a serious decision, putting a medication in our body, we should read up on it. Look at whether it's looking at videos from reliable sources, reading articles, learn about it. And you did that, and you came to the same conclusion that I did. The other thing that you said, I want to emphasize, and that's trust. And trust comes from experience and repeated encounters over time. And it's so important to have a clinician that you trust. It can be a pharmacist that you trust. We also trust certain aspects of the system. There's a long history of regulation, pharmaceutical regulation, and a long history of growth in the precision of manufacturing techniques that have led us to the point now where we are comfortable and trust that the medicines we get are what they're advertised to be, that they are made a certain way. And I'm curious, so you came to this conclusion. I know you talk with friends. What was your experience in discussion with friends? Did other people have other experiences, conclusions, and do you have a sense of what their experience has been?
Yes. I mean, firstly, when I had spoken to some people I knew had been thinking of and then using the compounds, we did have a discussion saying, boy, we don't even make the decisions on our medication if we want to do generics or not generics. That's a decision our physicians make. We're not physicians to be able to make those decisions. And here we're being offered compound medication versus true manufactured medications, and it's all out on the internet like, oh, suddenly it's our decision to make. And that was something that we had discussed. And when I spoke to three different friends, everyone had done it differently. One went through a diet type doctor who did write a prescription but was having the medications sent to his office at a reduced rate. And then another person who did it through a nurse practitioner with only a blood test on the internet, no doctor, no education, no follow through. And then another person who strictly just did it through the internet without having to say more than her name and phone number. And it was confusing because no one really knew where their medications were coming from, if they were counterfeit, if they were just plain compounded. But none of my friends didn't seem concerned. I was the one concerned, since now I was educated by you and tried to educate myself. Unfortunately, for consumers, there's really not much out there to help us see, learn, and find the resources that we need for this type of compound medication. It's all new to most of us.
It is. And, when one does a quick internet search, you find things like the FDA in just 8 months ago, in July of 2024, put out an alert on this issue. And they detailed in that alert dosing errors with some of the compounded semaglutide products. If one were to do an internet search over the last month, you would find out that just about a month ago, the American Diabetes Association issued a position statement on this issue, and I'll talk more about that later. Sara, I'm curious your perspective as you're listening to Lisa describe different friends getting medicines from different places. Any thoughts?
I think it's tough because you can understand why people have gone down certain paths just with the level of marketing and the things that they hear. But it's just also very concerning because, although there's so much media and advertising, that doesn't mean that the medication that someone will receive is safe, effective, or even approved. There's a recent study that I shared with some of you that my colleagues here at University of Colorado published that looked at different products and advertising being done by compounding pharmacies. And one of the pharmacies was even advertising something that they said they were dispensing. I'm not sure how that was happening, but it's not a component of any FDA approved product. It had been studied, but isn't FDA approved yet. And so, with that in mind, if you think about that, that's really concerning. Is that this process of compounding was intended to be a gap filler to meet this need of when there's a shortage of, an FDA approved product, that they take that component, make it into a non-approved product, and we say, oh, that's good enough for the time being to meet this gap before you get to your, go back to your approved product for different medications, processes, et cetera, or if they can't take a certain formulation. And that's really not what's happening in compounding anymore. And so really has shifted gears in how we view compounding pharmacies. And then that doesn't even touch the fact that there are also counterfeit medications in this space too.
Sara, let me follow up on something you mentioned, which is advertising. And we're all subject to the influence of advertising. If it didn't affect our behavior, companies wouldn't spend money on advertisements. Sue, I'd be interested in your thoughts when you saw the commercial about compounded medications aired during the Super Bowl. And we know those Super Bowl commercials cost $8 to $12 million or more. And there was a big commercial about the availability of compounded medicines through a particular company. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I will say I was watching the game. I am a huge Eagles fan. I'm just going to throw that out there for our audience. But for those amazing commercials, I think it's just indicative, like this is on the minds of a lot of people, right? People are talking about this. It's not just medical. It's social. It's made its way into conversations and discussions the way other things haven't in our medical world. I mean, nobody's talking about their blood pressure medicines at their dinner party with friends, right? But like everybody is talking about this. And on the whole, I think this is a great thing because engaged patients, right, make for engaging office visits. And there is a lot to talk about in this space. I mean, we've just given you all the pros and cons that we can think of. There's a lot to talk about. So for me, I want my patients to come to me to talk about this. I want to help them get the information they need to make a decision that feels comfortable for them. So, I think it's a good thing actually, because I think if it's out there and people are talking about it, I'm hoping they also come to their trusted care deliver person and talk
I,
to us.
Sue, I like your perspective. I had a little different perspective when I saw the commercial. And while I completely agree that it is good for this to be out there and for people to be talking about these issues, to be concerned about weight, far too long, the only commercials were those that pushed unhealthy foods. And it's good to see something saying, let's talk about health. But I didn't like the idea that it was by a company criticizing a healthcare system when that company puts no investment into research in making the medicines that we all benefit from, so might be able to undercut the price by that, and has no quality control responsibilities, i.e., saves money on every part of the process. and then brags that the process is wrong from which they are now benefiting financially and spending over $10 million to get us convinced that they're the best place to get this medicine from. So I came away with a little different feeling while at the same time agreeing that it's good that these are issues that are out there that we can all talk about. Sarah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on this.
I wanted to clarify the $10 million, was that the price of advertising for the Super Bowl?
Well, it's actually, I looked it up earlier today. The number I found was $8 million per 30-second commercial. I believe this was a 60-second commercial. And that is only the cost of the advertisement itself. There's an enormous other cost in producing the advertisement that is then aired. So it's actually well in excess of that $10 million figure, is
Wow.
my
I mean,
understanding.
you're exactly right. I think that says a lot about where they're investing their money. I think of things like pharmaceutical companies, and while they certainly do advertising as well, a lot of their budget, in my mind, goes to research and doing things like affordability programs to help patients access these medications. And so, you're exactly right. If a company is able to invest that much in advertising it and kind of undercutting the healthcare system through that same process, I have some concerns about that. And, I'm very curious about how they came up with the idea for that. But yeah, big picture, I would say I appreciate Sue's comment of we're focused on health, and we also want to recognize that this class of medications as a whole, specifically the FDA-approved products that have different FDA-approved labels, are used in so many different ways, and they're continuing to see more and more benefits for heart health, for kidney protection. We now have obstructive sleep apnea as an approved indication for some medications. So I think we see more and more of these uses. So it's great to start that conversation through some things like this advertising, but also I hope that leads itself to a balanced conversation of risk and benefit. Absolutely.
Really good point, Sue.
Well, and I feel like I should clarify. So maybe I should say I like the commercial in that it's bringing up a discussion, but like I want that,
Yeah.
like, talk to your healthcare provider, right? I would love that at the bottom of that commercial, 'cause that's what I want.
Yeah, that's so important. And Lisa, you've at another time shared with me that your friends don't all get the same advice that you get. Is that correct?
No,
When
I'm
we
the
come
one
in,
sharing. Yes, I'm learning from you and I'm sharing with them because they're not getting any advice. It's sad that to see that even this one physician, it's more like again, I called him a diet doctor because that's what it sounded like. It was how many people can I get in and how much can I sell? And the other two, again, the fact they didn't go through doctors or need scripts from doctors really concerned me.
yeah, and I do want to remind our listeners when we talk about losing weight, it's not just about weight, it's about health, and that it's about that whole package. Seeing a clinician who cares enough to choose the right medicine, who cares enough to spend some time with you, talking about the importance of exercise, both aerobic and resistance, who cares enough to discuss things like the right amount of protein in your diet in order to allow us to achieve optimal health. Sarah?
I think about that too, Neil, just piggybacking off of that comment of not only having that holistic approach to weight loss, which is so important and critical and can be, supported by an interprofessional team, but also that approach to managing this medication. So if we're thinking about this class of medications, there are risks of side effects, and having that guidance and support to help manage them, talking about nutrition, ways to maintain nutritional balance as you're potentially eating a little bit less through the appetite suppression of these medications, which then leads to the weight loss that people might be hoping for. And so I think, either way, having that team-based approach to support you as you either use these medications or pursue weight loss in a different way is just so important. And I know we've talked about that before, but something that I think becomes very important in this conversation where, when I hear about people potentially getting medications online or outsourcing and not having that conversation with their medical team, the point that they might be missing out on that additional support that can be so important. Lisa, what are your thoughts?
I was just going to add to what Dr. Skolnik was saying because he did educate me. You also had offered a nutritionist to me in the very beginning, which I thought, I didn't feel I needed because I felt I'm a healthy eater and I knew what to eat. But knowing that I had a medical professional behind me to get extra resources was really something very important that it doesn't seem these friends of mine and others are able to have. And I just didn't understand why they at least didn't go to their physicians first and have the conversation and then make it whether the decision was because of cost. Also, I know people said, oh, I don't have any medical conditions, so my physician's not going to write me a script. I just want to lose the weight.
That's a good point. Sue, let's come back now to advising patients. And I know patients ask you for advice on compounded medicines. What has helped formulate your thinking here, and what's your perspective when we stand back and look now at compounded medicines?
Yeah, I first, as everybody has said today, right? I start with FDA approved medications. We know they're safe. We know they're well tested. This is my preference. I make sure that I understand, that my staff understands how to get these medications approved for people through their insurance. If they have heart disease or diabetes, right? Those sorts of things change if these medications can get approved. So I really exhaust every avenue to try and use an FDA approved medication. And if a patient is specifically considering compounding, I discuss all of the concerns we just laid out. I even tell them about, my patients that have used compounded medicines who've shared that with me in their experiences. Lots of inconsistency with dosing and side effects. And at the end, right, we talk about that this is a decision that they will make, and it is based on their own personal risk tolerance, right? My job is to give them all of the risks, all of the information, but then also to tell them that I'm available if they decide to take these medications or not, right? If they use a compounded medication, I'm still here to be their doctor and I want to know about it and I want to help them through. And maybe at some point in the future, I can convince them to be on an FDA approved medication that might be safer for them. So I also don't close that door at the end of the discussion, right? I want them to have all of the information, make a decision based on their own risk tolerance, and do everything I can to help get them on the FDA approved medications, right? I think that's where we excel, especially as family doctors, right? I'm doing this all the time, right? So I really want to help them get on the safest medication for them. And if I close that door because they've chosen to use a compounded medicine, I can't help them in the future. So for me, it's important to also just be there for them, whatever it is they decide is the right choice they need to make.
Yeah, I think that's such an important concept. Sarah, your thoughts, how do you approach this as a pharmacist?
I think about ways that people might find other sources. And so just want to re-emphasize as a point to continue that relationship with your primary care provider rather than, seeking prescribing elsewhere if at all possible, just because you want to stick with where you already have that relationship. In terms of actually talking about the medications, I've certainly had friends, family members, colleagues talk to me about these medications, and I would say very similar points to Sue so far, and thinking about wanting to know where the medication is coming from and having that verified safety, efficacy, and quality standards that are met through that FDA approval process. I'll say an example was I was at a family trip and someone shared that they were putting their compounded injectable medication in the freezer. And they're like, well, is that okay if it's in the freezer? And, I didn't know they were using the compound. I thought they had the FDA approved product, which can't be frozen. And so immediately I was like, wait a minute, why is it in the freezer? But then they went on to share that they were actually using a compounded product, which said to be frozen. And so in my mind, the first thing that came up, well, what is the stability of data of that? Why is the FDA product says on the label, don't freeze, but the compounded product says freeze? And so that was one of the first triggers in my mind to think through, what is the evidence truly behind all of this? And how confident can someone be in the effectiveness of a medication that even the storage is different than the approved product?
That's a great example, Sarah. Thank you so much for that. We're about out of time. Lisa, any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, I'm almost at the end of my weight loss journey, and I'm excited that this medication was available for me and that you were able to guide me and educate me. And I thank you for that.
That theme of guidance and education is an important one. Sue, any final thoughts you have?
Yeah, engage your primary care doctor in this. Even though I'm not going to prescribe a compounded medication, I want to be there for that discussion, right? I want to do everything I can to help you make the best choice and get you on the medicines that are the safest for you. So don't be afraid to ask, right? We want to have these discussions with patients.
Excellent. Sarah, any final thoughts you have?
Yes, one point I wanted to add that we haven't talked about yet is related to the use of online pharmacies. And we know that these are growing in use. And so, one resource I wanted to just direct our listeners to was the FDA's education resources online regarding where to safely buy prescription medications. And that's called BSafeRx. So, if you're interested in learning more, wanting to find out, if you're already using one of these online pharmacies, what's the legitimacy behind it? How confident can I feel? I would recommend checking out the FDA's BSafeRx website to get a little bit more information in detail.
That's so helpful. We'll make sure to put that link in our program notes for today that everyone should see down where the notes are. Dr. Sue Kuchera, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Lisa Kessler, thank you so much.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And most of all, of course, a thanks to our listeners for joining us in this discussion of compounded and counterfeit GLP-1 and GIP-GLP-1 receptor agonists. I'd like to remind people that for more information on this topic, we've put links in the show notes to one of the FDA statements that I alluded to earlier and to the American Diabetes Association's position statement that I mentioned on compounded GLP-1 and GIP-GLP-1 agonists. In this statement, the ADA has said, and here I'll quote because I think it's particularly important, compounded GLP-1 receptor agonists and the dual GIP-GLP-1 receptor products, those are the weight loss medicines, are not identical to the FDA-approved products. Compounded GLP-1 RAs and dual GLP-1 RA products, again, the modern weight loss medicines, have been associated with clinically important dosing errors and adverse events. Counterfeit products that have made their way into the U.S. drug supply chain and have been advertised online by unregulated sources. The ADA statement summarizes the position of the American Diabetes Association, stating, and again I'll quote here, non-FDA approved compounded incretin products, those are the weight loss medicines we're talking about, are not recommended for use due to uncertainty about their content and resulting concerns about safety, quality, and effectiveness. So the American Diabetes Association is very clear in their stance on this. I hope this discussion was helpful in putting this issue into perspective. We've heard a lot of different thoughts. We've heard thoughts about the Wild West and comparisons with our modern day compounding. We've heard thoughts by Dr. Kuchera about how important it is to engage your primary care physician no matter what you do, and how we in primary care have an open door policy. You don't always have to agree with us, but we always want you coming back to talk with us. And Lisa, I love the points that you've made about the way that you decide who you are going to trust and do your own research as well. I think the term, if I remember there, is trust but verify, right? We want to decide who we want to trust and we want to think for ourselves. I can't think of a better model for approaching our personal health care. This special edition of Diabetes Core Update is sponsored by Lilly. For the American Diabetes Association, I'm Dr. Neil Skolnik. Till next time, stay safe and keep learning.